Hi, welcome to Tradition Today. I'm Father David Smith. I'm the pastor of St. George's Orthodox Church in Utica, New York. In a few moments, we'll be going to St. George's for a sermon that I preached there in September of the year 2000. But before we do, I'd like to say a few things about the subject that I address in the sermon. And the subject is how we influence children. What effect we as adults have on children, not only our children, but children throughout our culture. I want to read from St. Paul's letter, second letter to St. Timothy, chapter 3, verse 14, 2 Timothy 3:14. But you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. When St. Paul says to his young disciple, St. Timothy, when he says to him, you know from whom you have learned these things, who's he referring to? He's referring to himself. He's saying, you have known me since you were a little guy, since you were very young. And I want you to remember what I have taught you. You've known the Holy Scriptures. You've known me, and that's what I want you to imitate. In fact, in another part of the New Testament, St. Paul says, and it's not to St. Timothy, it's in a different letter, St. Paul says simply, imitate me. He simply says those words, imitate me. What he's saying is you can look at my life, and no matter what you see, I want you to know that that is the right way to do things. That is God's will for Christianity and for Christians. Seems like a pretty arrogant thing to say, as I say during the sermon. Seems like a pretty arrogant thing to say until you remember that St. Paul is saying it. When he says, imitate me, he's giving us a quick way of understanding how to look at various problems that may come up in our lives. St. Timothy wouldn't encounter only the things that St. Paul had told him about, but different things as he rose to prominence in the Christian church. And St. Paul is simply saying to him, I want you to do what I would do if I were in similar circumstances. My concern as I preach this sermon at St. George's, and as you're listening to me now, my concern is how it is that we influence children. Again, I don't just mean our own children, but all of us to some degree are around children. Even if it's only when we go to the grocery store and we go shopping where there are children near us. There are children in our community, in our extended families, in our church, perhaps at our workplace. And it's always a concern to me how it is that adults are teaching children by their example. Let me tell you a story. One day a father and his son went out for a walk on a crisp autumn day. And as they were walking along, the son looked up in the sky and he saw the clouds. And he said, Dad, what are clouds? How do they get there and what are they made of? And the dad looks up in the sky and he says, I don't know. I've never learned that kind of thing. And they walk on a little further and they walk by a tree that's just beautiful with fall colors. None of the leaves are green, but they're all gold and red and, fall colors. And the son says to the father, Dad, why is it that the leaves change color in the fall from green to these other colors? And the dad says, I've often wondered that myself, but I've never found out why. And they go a little bit further. and the son looks, and there's this beautiful sunset off on the horizon, and the sun is almost a bright red, kind of orange color, and the clouds around it are infused with the same light, and it looks like the horizon is on fire almost. And the son says to the father, "Why is it that when the sun goes down on the horizon it turns red, but you never see it red when it's up above us?" And the father goes, "That's a mystery to me." And when they get home, the son turns to the father and he says, "Dad, I hope you don't mind me asking all those questions." And the father says to him, "Hey, that's no trouble at all. How else are you going to learn?" You know, I like that story. I like that story because it always sounds like the son goes away satisfied. The son is satisfied. And why is he satisfied? Not because his questions are answered concerning information about the clouds or the trees or the sun or something like that. No, he is satisfied because he's gone on a walk with his father. He spent time with his father. I like to think of that story sometimes when my own children are asking me questions and asking me and asking me and asking me. I have 4 children, and sometimes it gets a little overwhelming. And you just want to say to them, "Why don't you be quiet for a little while or go do something else?" But I always have to remember, a child is not asking you questions in order to gain information. A child is asking you questions in order to hook you into their life. He's asking you questions because he wants some kind of reaction. The question may be completely off the wall. Why don't we ever see any elephants walking around in New York State, except in the zoo? They may ask you questions like that. What they want is a response. They want time. They want some connection with you, and they get it by asking these kinds of questions. I'm 40 years old, and I hate to talk about things like how we influence children sometimes because it makes me sound a lot older than I am. But really, I've seen some kind of a change take place from the time I was young until now. And it's a change that doesn't altogether make me happy. When I was young, there were certain things that adults did not talk about when there were children around. There were certain words that they didn't use when children were present. And there was a certain kind of an attitude that they had that they didn't have when children were present. I can still remember kind of walking into a situation where my father was talking with some of his friends. Maybe we were visiting somebody, and the men would always go into the wood shop, into the workshop. All of my father's friends had workshops, and they would go into the workshop and they would stand there talking. And maybe us kids might wander in too. As soon as we wandered in, the whole atmosphere changed. They used different words, they talked differently, they looked at us, everything was different because there were certain things that adults did not discuss in front of children. I find that to be almost completely absent in our modern society. You know, my children sometimes go and they visit friends, and one time they even went to a summer camp, and they come back from these things sometimes and tell me that they've seen movies that I know are, well, I can't even say have profanity in them. They are profanity. In one particular case, my wife and I had rented a movie one night. Somebody told us it was good. We rented it and we watched it. It wasn't all that bad, but the movie had so much profanity in it, it was almost like it wasn't profanity anymore. I mean, it was profanity. And I really didn't like it because of that. And sure enough, at one point, my children came home. 3 of my children came home from someplace, and they told me they had seen that movie. I thought, How in the world could this be? How could it be that people would allow children to watch a movie like that? How could it be that someone would think it was okay for children to hear profanity like that? I went recently to pick up my son from a soccer game, and as I was waiting there, the soccer game was kind of winding down to its final seconds, and parents were coming along, and a couple came along, and they had a son who was about 7 years old. Their son on the field was about 10, like my soccer player is, and as the mom and the dad came alongside of me, I heard the mother use profanity. She swore about something. I don't know what it was. It had to do with a soda that was in her hand or something. Now, I heard it, and I was further away from her than her own son was. What is this? Why is it that we want to convey this kind of language to our children? Why don't we just sit down with them and look them in the eye and say, you know, I am an ignorant and filthy person, and I hope that you can be too when you grow up. I mean, I don't understand it. I don't understand why people do that, why they use that kind of language around children. Because, you know, it isn't going to be the case that the children will use that kind of language when they get older. No, it's the case that they use it when they hear it. And so you encounter sometimes children who are very young who are using profanity regularly and thus are unable to express themselves properly. And number two, they are violent in their language and therefore tend to be violent in their actions. This is my own belief, but I think it's true. I think it's wrong for us to use profanity around children. And while I'm on my soapbox, I sometimes when I go to a convenience store, if I go to buy gas someplace or if I go pick up a newspaper or whatever the case may be, I'll be standing in a convenience store line and I'll see parents buying lottery tickets when their children are with them. Again, I wonder, what in the world are these people thinking? What are they thinking? Why don't they sit their child down in front of them and look them in the eye and say, my hope in life is to make a whole lot of money that I haven't worked for by gambling. That's my hope. Oh, incidentally, my son or daughter, this is the reason we don't go to church, because my hope can't be in God. All of my hope is in the lottery. Oh, and incidentally, when you get older, you can run your credit card bills right through the roof because you can bank on the fact that someday you'll win the lottery and then you'll be able to pay them off. I wonder, what is it that people think they are conveying to their children when they hand all of their money over to the government in this kind of a ghastly long shot for unimaginable riches? I also wonder sometimes when I hear parents talk to their children about things like divorce, about things like their relationships with other people. I was sitting with a woman one time who was trying to speak to her daughter about the fact that she was going to get divorced from her husband. And as she tried to explain this, it occurred to me that the longer it takes us to explain something to a child, probably the more convoluted it is. And this woman was trying and trying and trying to come up with the words to say what was really the truth. That is, well, myself and your father are both extremely selfish and immature people, and we really don't care about you at all, so we're going to split up because we would like to try something different and we're bored with marriage. That's really what she should have been saying, and that is most certainly what her daughter heard, no matter if she was saying, well, sometimes people grow apart, honey, and we still love you, and we love each other, but we've just come to this place in our lives, and all of these things that people say to children. What are we going to do here? You see, my concern is not for children on a sort of a grand scale. I'm not concerned with our educational system or with community programs or with whatever the Boy Scouts think about this and that. I'm not concerned with all of those things as much as I am concerned with you and how it is that you influence children. How do I influence children? What is going on inside me that comes out in a way that influences our next generation? Again, I'm going to go to 2 Timothy chapter 3. Listen to what St. Paul says. But you, speaking to St. Timothy, you have carefully followed my doctrine, manner of life, purpose, faith, long-suffering, love, perseverance, persecutions, afflictions, and so on and so forth. You have carefully followed them, he says to Timothy. You have carefully followed them. I want you to make that a study. You have seen how I live my life. I want you to know that I am doing my best to live according to God's will, sincerely doing my best to live according to God's will, and therefore I'm asking you to continue to look at my life and to model your life after what I do. It's my prayer. It's my longing that every single person listening to this right now, just as it was when I had people in my parish listening to my sermon that we're about to hear, it's my prayer, my longing that we would all consider this in our lives. How do I influence the children who see me behave the way I do? How is it that I am investing in the future by living according to God's will in front of them so that they can grow and become a better generation than we are? Well, let's go now to St. George's Antiochian Orthodox Church in Utica, New York, to hear a sermon delivered in September of the year 2000 on the subject, How We Influence Children. One of my favorite holiday movies is It's a Wonderful Life, the Frank Capra movie with Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed in it. I think it's a lot of people's favorite movie because I saw a survey done at one time that said that more people own that movie than any other movie. I don't know how true that is, but I know a lot of people have seen it. I hope all of you have seen it. If not, it's a great movie to see. You know how it goes. George Bailey is thinking that his life was worthless, that his life wasn't meaningful in any way, and he even wishes that he were dead. And his sort of absent-minded angel, guardian angel named Clarence, shows him what life would have been like had he not lived. And so as he's walking around, he sees that, well, his children don't exist, of course, because his wife never got married. When he was young, he saved his brother's life, if you remember that part of the story. And so, because he wasn't there to save his brother's life, his brother died, and the country lost a war hero. And but most of all, it's that little town of Bedford Falls or something where it's so nice and clean and family-oriented, and as soon as he sees that he never existed, he sees that it's this place of debauchery and drunkenness, and it's got a new name, Pottersville, the name of his archenemy, and so on. And so he says to himself, well, I guess my life really was meaningful. I guess my life really did have an influence on my world. I would wish that we would have that happen to all of us. At some point, to be able to see what it was that we were, how it was that we were influencing our world. And especially today, I think about children. How is it that each of us has influenced the children in our lives, the children around us? I ask that question specifically because of the epistle reading for today, the reading that Kelly did for us from the second letter of Paul to St. Timothy. St. Paul met St. Timothy's mother when St. Timothy was a little boy. So he really grew up knowing about St. Paul. He knew his example. He knew him as an adult. And then later on, when St. Paul was an old man, St. Timothy was an adult, and he became one of the great bishops of the church, of the early church. What does St. Paul say to St. Timothy? He says, if you know how I live, you know how I conduct myself, I want you to do exactly the same thing. You know how I live, I want you to live the same way. Seems like an arrogant thing to say in a way, but it really doesn't when we consider it's St. Paul saying it, who led such a blameless and holy life. I wish that all of us would be able to say that. I wish that all of us would be able to say to any child we encounter, you know, I hope you're like me. I want you to be like me. I think most of us would or should be saying something a little bit different. I heard a song this week. I think it's been around for a long time, but I never hear things when they first come out anymore. I always hear them after they've been out a while. There's a rock band called Creed. It's a little too heavy for me. If any of you have heard it, it's really kind of rattles my bones, their music. But I like some of the words that they say. And there's one particular song, the lead singer of the group wrote it when he found out his wife was pregnant with their first child. It's called With Arms Wide Open. And he sings about how he's welcoming his child into the world. Welcome to this place, I'll show you everything. It's a beautiful song, very poignant. But there's about, the third or fourth verse. I can't quite make out what verses are anymore in music. But anyway, after they sing for a little while, he says, if I had just one wish, only one desire, I hope you're not like me. I hope you understand. What a thing to say. What a thing for a young man who's about to have his first child, he and his wife about to have their first child. What a thing to be able to say. It shows an unusual depth of maturity, I think, especially for someone who's a rock star. He's saying to his child, welcome to this world, but you know what? I hope you're not like me. I hope you understand when I say that to you. I think most of us have to say that. Most of us, if we had the ability, would say that to the children in our lives. Now, I'm not simply talking about the children that we happen to have ourselves, our own children. I'm saying this to us as a group, to us as a church, and it pertains to the children that are in this church. I like having children in the church. I think you know that. I like having children here. But we, as the adults of this church, have to consider how it is that we are influencing the children of our church. We have to constantly keep that in our minds. I remember when I was little, I went to the United Methodist Church in Manlius. That's a church where I grew up. I still remember the faces of certain people that were in that church. I don't know their names. Some of them became Sunday school teachers, and I remember a couple of names, but mostly it's faces of sitting in that church and looking next to me and seeing someone whose face told me that they loved God. That they really loved God. That they were there because they loved God. And looking over here and here, usually older people, though not always. Boy, that still, to this day, influences the way I pray. It influences the way I see God and the way that I live my life in faith. You know what I hope? I hope that sometime, 20 years from now, there will be a child who is part of this church. Maybe we haven't even met this child yet. Maybe they haven't come to the church yet. Maybe they're not even born. But 20 or 30 years from now, for someone to be sitting and talking with a friend and say, you know, there was that man or that woman at St. George's when I was growing up, and when I looked into their face, I knew God was real. That's what I want. I want us to be able to do that. Not to be leading our children in ways that are going to make them casual about the faith, but ways in which will let them know truly, unmistakably, that God is real, that God is alive, both now and ever and unto ages of ages. Amen.
Christ is risen, Christ is risen from the dead, traveling down death by death, and the marvels in the tombs, and the marvels in the tombs, and the marvels in the tombs, His glory light.
St. Tikhon's has always been one of the centers of the church. We have different kind of services that we offer, not only through the liturgy, like we say that is celebrated every day, but also through the work at the seminary that the monks have been doing since the inception of the seminary in 1938, when it was founded by Archbishop Arseny, the builder of the monastery. Also, the monks also travel. Some of them do give lectures and give retreats. For many years I traveled with the mission choir, raising funds for the seminary. Also, the monks are involved in different work of kind of upkeep, keeping our repositories and our museums clean, and making sure that the icons are in good shape, and that we're kind of caretakers of all the treasures that St. Tikhon's has. There's so many different kind of cultural and historical monuments that we house here at the monastery. That work is very difficult sometimes, just to kind of the upkeep of the property. We have almost 300 acres. It's not exclusively the monasteries, but it's shared by the monastery and the seminary. So the upkeep of a couple hundred acres of land is very difficult, and all the things that are housed thereon. Monasticism in general for the Orthodox Church is at the forefront of the spiritual battle. It's the front runner of the spiritual life in the church. It kind of plows the way for the rest of the people, the laity and the priests doing the work. The monastics are doing the battle on the spiritual level, whereas sometimes the priests and the laity do more of the physical battling for the kingdom, where they set up churches, whereas a monk, his entire work is consecrated to prayer. And it's through the prayers of the saints and through the monastics who offer their life in sacrifice to the Lord that the Lord bestows His benediction and His blessing upon the work that is done by everybody else. So really, monasticism here is exemplified through the liturgical life that we have here, and through the daily life of prayer that each monastic has in his own cell. The liturgy has been celebrated here almost daily since 1905, so for almost 105 years. The liturgy has been offered up, and it becomes a real source of power. There's such a kind of forward movement of strong, powerful spiritual energy that's blessing and benefiting all America. This kind of power and strength that comes from the prayers here is incalculable, and it's inestimable. The value of it is hard to understand. But really, when we begin to understand it, we begin to really kind of tap into the mystery of the spiritual world, which is present among us, but the effects often are not always seen immediately. More recently, we've been involved in work with a candle factory. We have our own candles now that we're offering, hand-dipped 100% beeswax candles that we're offering for the church in America to use for worship. Those are available at the bookstore. Well, St. Tikhon's, we have our own hives, so we produce quite a bit of honey. A monastery is often kind of akin to a hive, because there's always so much activity. So usually when we see maybe different bees kind of gathering, just kind of spontaneously creating a hive at a monastery, which has happened I've seen before at different monasteries. It's a very good sign. It's a sign of God's blessing upon the monastery, because of course bees are such hard workers, and also there's a sweetness there that comes from their work that we partake of.